Looks like we are live. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Josh's Game Grit. This will be episode 43, I think? Yeah, 43. That's the one. The one in which Josh does some illustration work for your entertainment. We'll see how it goes. I have a couple of things in mind for today's stream. I'm gonna walk you through kind of an art style that I've worked in for a long time, and then I'm also going to be tinkering with something a little bit different, possibly in the second half. We'll see how it goes. I see most of our regulars are here, and in fact I'm a little bit late, so you guys are already in the chat. Hello everyone, TK, B, Jared, Richard. Oh, and I see Ryan has joined us as well. Hello Ryan. Good to see all of you, hear from all of you. Hope things are going well for you guys. I don't have too much in the way of other updates this week. I thought I might just do some illustration stuff. We are in the midst of getting Gascony's Legacy ready to fulfill. So I got to do another last minute pass on all of our backer data and update that from our Kickstarter stuff. I'll be posting a Kickstarter update about that pretty soon, actually. I previously gave people until the end of November, or the end of October, or beginning of November, November 1st, to submit address changes for Gascony's Legacy, because it's coming. It's coming. And of course, if any of you want a copy as well, by all means message us, and we will be able to do that when we allocate the pallets and ship the game. But it's coming. Otherwise, been kind of an interesting week. Been doing a lot of prep work for various projects, actually. It's a little bit of kind of have, I think it's the usual story of like a lot of things are at different stages, so I kind of go between each of the things and just push each one a little bit further every week. And this week, I need to be able to gear up to do some more illustration for one of our upcoming projects. And some of you might actually recognize this one. So of course, what I'm about to show you is obviously, because I'm making it right now, it's not licensor approved, and nor will it even be what gets submitted to the licensor necessarily. Probably I will continue to work on it after the stream. But yeah, let's dig in. So we were talking before about, I was showing you guys some of the tiles from Terminator. This is a really fancy game tile. Look at this really high detail prototype component. Behold the majesty of square cardboard. This has a 1.5 inch grid drawn on it, which is the scale that I'm going to be using. I'm going to be illustrating basically this tile today. And I'm currently working on a game that has a whole set of these. But this is going to be the actual size. You're going to get a stack of these in the box. You're going to arrange them to make a play area, which means that the first rule of tile design is that they're going to have to tessellate. And you want to make sure that no matter which way players put them together to make a play area, in this case we're going to take 4 of these tiles and make a square, no matter which way the players put these tiles together, they should look like they belong. And sometimes if you do like very aggressive perspective and illustrations on your tiles, getting that to look right can be a real challenge. In particular for our Terminator one, when we did those tiles, we actually discovered that all the perspective had to kind of be faked. There wasn't like, it didn't follow the rules of perspective quite perfectly because they had to adhere to a hex grid and the edges were different widths. So even though I was kind of showing like looking in the room top down and the walls kind of sloping towards the floor as you're looking down at the tile, we kind of had to do some weird stuff like that. My goal for this set is actually not to get too much into the perspective. We're going to go for basically a straight overhead illustration, and we're going to be working on basically this scale. So yeah, that's pretty good. The corners cut off a little bit when you see it on screen here, but it's not too bad. We should be able to handle this nicely. Alright, so yeah, I've got a few layers in here already, my layers palette, and I've done my setup for my document. So this tile is I've already put my grid lines in, painted them in. And this tile is, the squares are 1.5 inches from this sort of guideline here across, which works out to be, in print resolution, 450 pixels. Quite a lot of pixels per square, so we'll have to fill them. There's some weirdness going on in the corner. This is actually my bleed area. So if we functionally, what I've done is this black border here that I'm now showing you. This area should not be on the finished product. This is the area that will be off-cut when the die cut happens. However, I want to make sure that wherever that die cut falls, the tiles don't get messed up too much. And so I've already got my grid lines running to the edge. And there's sort of two schools of thought on this. You either don't put this line in, the one I'm about to draw over top of. You either don't put these lines in around the edge, so that your edgemost squares don't have a grid square line that borders the edge of the tile, because it might be cut off. So you just assume it won't be there and do it anyway. You just remove that line, let the cut between the tiles be the grid lines. That kind of works, except that then you have to visually realize that wherever you have two tiles put together when you're playing the finished game, wherever those two tiles meet is functionally an invisible grid line, which aesthetically kind of works, but it's not as obvious as I would like. So the best solution here is probably actually going to be, rather than leaving that one off, the best bet is probably going to be to fill the edge entirely with a grid line color. Because then, even if it's miscut slightly, the end result will just be a thicker grid line, but there will still be a grid line present. What's going on here? We got them. Ah, there we go. So now we've got this whole set. Were they black before? They were yellow before. I often do my grid lines in a color that isn't white or black, and the main reason for that is it tends to look better on the art. So let's put them back in there and do some blending to the background. Can save this. And of course, I'm super paranoid from years past. I've done enough illustration work to be really paranoid about saving regularly. I have a couple of horror stories from working on very big files, big map illustrations, putting like an hour or an hour and a half worth of work into them, having Photoshop spontaneously crash because I tried to do something, and then losing everything. B says, I'm very dark on camera today. I think it's because it's very, very bright behind me and I still haven't bothered to get blackout curtains. TK says it's the gritty reboot. Could be. Could be. Dylan, you shouldn't be anxious for Gascony. We've looked at all the sample manufacturing copies. I got another box from China with production samples of Gascony's Legacy. And can confirm that pretty much everything is fixed. There's one small issue they have to correct yet, but yes, it's always an adventure with that one. So, tile illustrations. We want to make sure all the edges work. So I'm not going to have anything on these tiles that runs off the edge. I want to make sure that everything I do is going to be fully contained within a reasonable safety area inside the tiles. Now, I've given my... Thank you. Wow, a landline rings. Whoever it is, they're not getting answered right now. That's just how that goes. And yes, I have a landline. We never hear it, except if it's spam. But oddly enough, the apartment building in which I live, you have to have a landline because they currently cannot redirect the door code buzzer to a cell phone because it is also ancient and they haven't updated it. So I think I was strong-armed into getting the landline when I moved in here, which would have been a number of years ago now. I've had it ever since. Fun fact about me. So, don't need this stuff. This is the mask for the bleed area, which I'm just going to leave black for now. We'll have to remember to make sure that all the art goes under it later. If I make it mostly black, that will work. Alright, so there's a couple parts to this. The grid sort of being only the beginning of the tile illustration. Generally, because it's a game, I'm going to need various sorts of terrain and features on these tiles. Yeah, Ryan says, I bet it was Tommy calling you. I bet it was too. He doesn't actually call that phone number unless he can't reach my cell. So maybe something's up. But I don't think it's Tommy. I get no messages on my actual cell phone. There we go. So we get a couple of... We're going to have a couple of layers, and they're going to be stacked vertically. There's going to be the grid layer we've already got. Behind that grid layer is going to be all of our ground layer stuff. So whatever the floor of the tile illustration is. Probably grass in this case. I'm looking at illustrating an outdoor field, sort of a grassy ruin kind of setup is the plan. Although we could just as easily do any number of things. You guys can have a peek at all of my various Photoshop assets that I've been building for the last 10 years. Probably longer than that, actually. It's probably more like 15 years now. I don't know if any of these are the originals or not. How old some of these would be. So let's have a quick look at... Let's not do that. Let's start a ground layer. So under the grid... That's probably a little bit too high detail. Now, I have a lot of patterns that I use that are just seamless textures. This is a seamless pattern I made based off a photo of like a grassy field at one point, I think I would have made. And I gave myself this pattern in several sizes. I'll have to sort of figure out... If you make textures too small when you're starting a tile, they look horrible. Because they become just noise. You can even see the vertical banding in this where it's tiling. But if you make them too big, they tend to look kind of too chunky for what you want. Ideally, you want something that looks like it's in the same scale as your characters. Or whatever the scale of the game is, your units. So for something like this, where we plan to have actual characters be on this grid, it makes sense that we would have some detail of grass. Now, that issue I was talking about with the patterning before, I like to use pattern fills like this basically as the starting layer for my illustration, but they tend to be, they're too raw, they're too garish, and nothing looks like this. It's too regular because it is a repeating pattern. One of the best ways you can do that and just get a little bit more variation out of it is to take a couple of different patterns and blend them. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to stick in a few... We're going to stick in a few different kinds of... That's not going to do it. A few different kinds of grass layer. No. Color. And then I'm going to start blending them together to get them all kind of in sync. So I'm looking at my thumbnail in the corner right now, trying to get the tone about the same. So that's pretty cool. And if we look at, this is how I'm blending them together, so I can look at them under a mask. Anything that's red is the layer that will be knocked out. So red is where I'm not using my previous image. And I actually want only the mask. I'm going to change its size a little bit. That will change the blending that I put in there. Let's have a look at up close. It's a bit, there's a bit of a jarring disconnect between these two patterns because they're very different sharpnesses, which is a little weird. I might want that one underneath. Yeah, I don't think that's working. So let's go back to this way. Tinker with the blending a bit and see if we can get it better. Now the other possibility here is that I blur some of the underlying layers. We'll see how that goes. It's starting to come together, starting to look like less than just a single blurry shape. It seems to have gone a lot better, actually. So now we've got a field. Yay, field. What next? A big part of getting a map like this, or any type, sort of tile design to look right, is, especially if you're doing grass, is to get the right green. You can communicate a lot about what's going on a map based on how bright or dark green your green is, and how yellow it is, yellow to blue. Generally, yellow is really good for sunny kind of environments. You go yellower. Nighttime, you tend to go almost like a dark blue over top of your grass layer. Looks pretty decent, actually. Probably not that dark. Probably, let's see. That's probably a good compromise. We can always do some additional shading to them. Because even after I get all of the details sort of painted in and figured out, there's often a lot of room to do extra work with highlighting and shading. One of the ways you can really make them pop is by overexposing the center of the tile. It adds a lot of dimension to them in a really subtle way. Just have to play around with it and get the detailing right. So now the corners are darker. So when I get a whole set of these together, I'm going to have sort of spotlighted areas in the middle of each tile, which might work really well. We'll make them blend together less. I do this a lot for rooms, interior rooms on maps, because it tends to make each room more distinct and have the corners or edges of a room be more full of shadow. It actually does a really good job of simulating overhead lighting. Now, if this is totally outside and it's like a bright sunny day, then that lighting should basically be even, minus whatever shadows are going to be on stuff in the middle. But if it's indoors, or I want, streams of light or something coming down, it's going to be much better if I get that. Get that in there. Jared says, I'll use the clone tool to throw repeating things off of a grid. Makes it look more natural. Yeah, you can do that too. I actually tended to build all of the patterns I just finished laying out that you guys saw a moment ago. all of these are repeating patterns that I actually built myself using the clone tool. So these ones are big enough that it's hard to see where they repeat. But if you do a good job on your repeating patterns, you can hide some of that repetition. I think this one is this big, looks like. Sort of almost the width of the tile. So I could probably get away with using this one in the mix. It's got a little bit more of a perspective to it, which doesn't always translate very well when you're trying to do something top-down. But we do have the opportunity here to get a couple of layers in, a couple of ground layers in here. But we should also think about, before we go too far into making details, we should think about what's actually going to be on this tile. So I've got the game that this is going to be for has several kinds of terrain. And they're marked using outlines. So I've set up my grid in Photoshop to be the same size. Looks like the snap's turned off for reasons. Yep, okay, that's annoying. And rather than drawing individual lines, I would much rather just make lines by putting strokes on shapes. Tend to get better results that way, and it's much easier to edit. In this case, I've set my fill really low. Now I can draw some stuff. So we actually have some tiles to design. There are 3 kinds of terrain that are going to be on these tiles. There's a blocking terrain, which can really be whatever, but we're going to use it probably for rocks or trees or something big and difficult to move through that you normally can't move through, but you might be able to fly over. So that'll be our red terrain outline. Call that layer blocking. We're going to have a cover layer, which I think we'll make blue. And obviously doing it this way also means it's real easy to adjust everything later, because they're all just layer styles. And we're also going to have some rough terrain, and I'm going to make that one yellow. If you've played any tactics games before, there's a very common color scheme. It's practically standard. I think probably comes from original Dungeons and Dragons type stuff, although maybe not. So those lines work. They actually interfere a little bit with the grid. You can see where the grid overlaps them. They are a little bit too big. Might actually be better to do these as inner glows, then they won't be so harsh. So let's see. Let's do something like that. It's a lot easier to see, that's for sure. And we can of course tinker with the opacity later as well if we want. But for now, I'm going to assume that I want everything really, really bright and colorful. This will at least give me a good reference point for later. Okay. Plug everything in, and away we go. So I am preserving the grid not too badly. The blue one for cover is actually going to be a little bit hard to see against this background, but depending on what that cover is, if it's bushes or what I affectionately call waist height terrain, any of that sort of stuff will really just show through underneath those lines. And I probably won't be filling those squares, so it will be a lot more obvious in the final illustration once we get things in there that those squares have stuff in them and are, obstacles to hide behind. That will mostly be accomplished through the art. So let's fill out some cover areas. Blocking terrain is probably going to be most important for getting the feel of the tile right. So let's actually design a few here. What has happened? Huh. Thumbnail rendering bug in Photoshop. That's cool. Alright. Tactics games live or die by how interesting or varied the terrain tends to be. So coming up with a good tile design that at least has some variety to it will really help with that. Let's do this. Actually need my lines to all be inside the tile. Probably needs a little bit overhanging on some of the edges, otherwise they're just going to be very easy to navigate. Let's try that. So now this tile will actually have an open lane all the way through it. So one of these four corners, if we're going to make a map out of four tiles like this in a square, one of these corners is going to be the center of the game board. Center of the play area. So it's worth thinking about what is in each of the corners, because that is, when you put several of these tiles together, that's what's going to be in the center of the map. So let's fill them in just a little bit more. Something like, yeah, that's probably fine. It's probably enough terrain. We can also get quite a range of feel out of the game based on how much of the tile has terrain in it as well. But the important part here is that now I've got a plan. I know what I'm going to put, roughly, what sort of things I'm going to put in each of the various squares. And because I've got that figured out so far, now we can move on to interesting other stuff. So I've got my basic ground. Let's assume grass is the standard ground. Let's look at something like, let's throw down some layers of dirt and sand here. Probably get some rubble in there too in a second. Where's my sand? Too much sand. Those are way too sandy. Yeah, that's gonna work better. Alright, so here probably want a couple that are sort of like that. Let's do a bit of blending. You don't want it to be too overpowering. Probably adjust the color slightly as well. There we go. So now I've got two different styles put together. Make them a little bit more distinct. And then I need something that's probably like broken ground or gravel. Let's see what I've got for gravel. Yeah, that could be believably difficult to navigate. Those are pretty big stones. If a person is if this is like a 5-foot square for a person, it's probably like a 3-foot square in this game's scale. These things are pretty close together. But like this, the classic sort of D&D 5-foot square rule generally looks good on maps, and a lot of people in a lot of games are illustrated to that style, to that size. Let's see. Yeah, now we got some rocks. Some dusty, dusty rocks. It's starting to look pretty good. Let's do... I actually don't like this color difference. I think there's too big a gap. So I'm going to also recolor it. You want some color variation, but not so much that it suddenly looks like a different thing. That's important. I want to make sure these aren't going to appear in huge groups together, so I want to make sure that they are interesting enough. How big is this file? I think I actually need something a little bigger. Let's go. What the heck am I doing right now? I am making a mask, but I want it a different size. The clouds filter does not do the best job of being rescalable. So if I want them to be adjustable beyond helpful. Nuisance. Fine, we'll scale it here. Now I've got a much more granular blur. It looks like... There, you can see it there in that jump. Many more areas that are more finely spaced. That will help give me the actual texture I want. Okay. Better. Now what? This would assume that the entire tile was going to be difficult terrain, but that's not ever going to be the case. I think it'll make for a very uninteresting game if we ever make a tile that is that busy. So let's blend those areas together. That will help. I think also probably want a little bit more saturation on this color. Gotta get it just the right level of dusty. But now I've got a layer that I can freely paint in to make rough terrain at will. That will be useful. And then of course I can, I'm going to do all of my basic layering in. I'm going to get all of my terrain types kind of blocked in and designed. And then we'll be able to go back in later to the whole tile and fine-tune the appearance of certain squares, adding things to it, smaller details and the like. This is still just very base level patterning type stuff as we lay things down. But hopefully the goal here is that once we figure out the style for all of the different parts and how all of these different things will sort of be common among the tiles, the first 75% of the work where we lay out, design the tile, put all the features on it, and all of that, once all of these ground layers are done and put down, we'll be able to do all of those steps for any future tiles really quickly, and they'll also end up being, they'll look really similar to each other because they all use the same textures and same assets, right? If I save this and then start a copy of it and edit it and make a different tile and save that one, if they're all using the same parts, they're going to be really nice to seamlessly put together to make larger play areas. And that's really important. B said, you described this game as a competitive game. Do you consider creating a solo mode with an AI, or will this be solely competitive? That is probably an interesting enough question to be its own stream, to be honest. I always am interested in solo type games, or games that are soloable, particularly if they are strategy games. But some games are easier to automate than others, or more worthwhile to automate than others. It sort of depends on what we're going for with the design and who we think the target audience is. So far, this game is, the game that this tile is going to be for, is not going to be co-op or solo, but that's not to say it's not possible. And it also won't really impact how we design the tiles either, because we want to have kind of, full options. We don't want to limit ourselves design-wise while we are coming up with the tile designs, in case we want to change how part of the game works later. So these mechanics that we're tinkering with now, the rough terrain, the blocking terrain, the cover terrain, and so on, for sure those are all in the game. I'm not really adding new stuff to this rule set while I'm making this tile. Although, perhaps in future that will be something we do. Let's see. It's looking better already. So if that's my rough terrain and I've got my ground, I think I probably also want a generic sort of dust, like a dust sand layer. Let's go something like that. Really easy way to make dust really quickly. If you just want like some grit, some noise, it's actually a little bit too small. Not one, not two. Maybe even three. No, two's good. Get some grit in there. Turn it way down. And there we have something that is believably a little bit sandy. And we'll put another layer in on top. Let's do that. grit's too obvious. That's pretty good. Let's do one more layer. And then we can get all of that kind of set here. There. Now we've got not a totally uniform texture to our sort of sandy grass area here. And I'm actually going to put, let's call it dust. Let's put this one as grass. And you can imagine, if this were a real place that people visited often, there would probably be spots where people commonly walk and run down the grass, right? Heavily pathed areas are going to have less grass than others. So I can easily go through and kind of work those in. And get some more interesting edging here as well. Depends on whether I want them to actually be hard-edged or not. I do have the option of something like actually doing a shadow, because I like to highlight the difference between the two layers where you run out of grass. So let's do something like this. Blend my edges a little bit better. Not too much. Too much. The path looks a little bit too perfect now as well. Starting to look a little better. Not necessarily a good mix for our rough terrain, rough ground patch here, but we can get there. Let's blend them together a little better. Because again, only the actual terrain outline matters for the purposes of playing the game, so we can have a little bit more of a believable edge around all of our rough terrain. Let's not do it quite so aggressively against the edges of the tile so that we can preserve some of the blending. Looking pretty good. Alright. That's probably enough for our ground layer for now. May go back and add some additional, like, tall grasses or something. But I think we can move straight on into objects and obstacles now. Yeah, so what do we want for actual obstacles? Probably easiest stuff for now would be like some small rocks and some waist height like trees and bushes or something. That seems like a good fit for what we're doing. I have all kinds of tools that I've been making over the years to streamline that process for myself. This is my most common one. I have a series of brushes that I made using overhead photos of trees, which is a really good way to get nice tree-like shapes very quickly and build up basically bushes that look passably realistic in their shape. Let's save this again. Who knows if my computer will decide to croak once I start doing heavy Photoshop work and running OBS and streaming to YouTube. We'll see. We'll see. So let's do... Those are too small. Get a couple of different styles here. Oh, I have a whole set of these, because of course I do. And actually, I'm being a little bit overkill at the moment. I don't need this layer of detail yet, because this is actually a better top. Let's put that away for the moment. Want to reference it, thank you. Okay, let's fill in our bottom here. That's a pretty good bottom of bush. So let's do, yeah, let's make it a mask. Now let's paint some stuff. Cool. So that's going to be our footprint for our grass, or for our bush. Let's get a little bit, let's get it a little bit more defined. It should be casting a nice dark shadow onto the surroundings. Not sure how much I'm going to keep the actual direction yet. I have illustrated maps before where we keep all of the details kind of all lit from the same direction, which is great if you have a map that's a static illustration, but as soon as you get into tiles, having fixed shadow directions for anything bigger than like these little rocks here tends to get very problematic. You start to kind of, you see like, oh, this half of the map, it's 9 a.m. and at this half of the map, it's 5 p.m. and the sun's setting over there, as it is now starting to do, because we're getting into fall weather here. It'll be dark soon enough. My God. But very much getting into trying to decide what to do with the lighting source of the map. Because if I decide to give this a very obvious highlight and shade direction, it's going to look weird when I start putting the different tiles together. They're not going to play well. So let's do that for starters. some nice detailing in there. And then this one, probably more of the same. Let's do this. So now I'm starting to directly paint layers onto this cover. I'm going to end up with kind of multiple layers of the leaf brushes and stuff over the top here. And then that's going to result in having all kinds of good stuff. Let's fill that. Let's make the top layer a little bit brighter. And paint a few more. This brush, actually, the default for this brush, I don't usually use it specifically for doing this, so it's a little bit too variant at the moment. Let's change the size jitter a little. And I've made this also a little bit too yellow. Much too much. Now I could go in here and paint all of these layers, give them highlight and shadow, and I probably should. At the same time, I'm not super concerned about... That's starting to look really nice and detailed. Even if it is just a blob, sometimes that's all your brain needs to really figure it out. Let's make the bottom one a lot darker. Okay. Sometimes you just gotta feel for it a little bit. There. That is a very large bush we could be hiding behind or in. And actually benefit having a little more under in some places. And you notice I paint exclusively with layer masks, like I don't actually paint in other colors, I'm just using black and white. Lets me separate coloring things from shaping things, which is really handy if I decide later that all my bushes are the wrong color. I can just go in and repaint all of the color layers without changing or having to repaint the bushes on top. And I think this probably still needs a little bit of help. Probably needs something like, let's go, I think it needs a little bit of highlighting still. I'm putting this in the right place, yeah. Okay, that's going to be too much, but particularly in print this is going to be helpful. Actually, I think it might be better to do the whole bush as a top texture layer. Let's do this. And see if it's too much. So, I don't know, that's certainly too much right now. But something like this. You're gonna get too much out of this. Might be too busy. It's a very programmatic way of doing illustration, which maybe is not surprising to you given the other sorts of illustration that I do and or other kinds of game design and development that I do. Perhaps not surprising that I have a very programmatic style for doing map illustration as well. So here, this is getting to be way too much. I think we've kind of killed it, to be honest. It got a little bit too detailed. Might look okay on the lower layer by itself. But probably should go in and actually add some shading to these as well, even the topmost layer. Bushes are kind of fun because they can just kind of be a little bit formless and you can get away with it. TK1138 says, something tells me terrible battles will be happening in this countryside, though. Oh, man. This is the Dirksen Virtual Ranch. Yeah, it's true. Actually, a funny thing has happened now. The bush is a super realistic, kind of dark olivey green, and the rest of the map is like really washed out happy fun time. And they don't really look like they belong together anymore. Which happens. Without having a really good reference piece for the rest of this, it can be really easy to get into that space. I think probably what I need to do is switch up some of these to be colors, or textures rather. No, let's do this differently. Let's do this the other way. My Photoshop is starting to choke a little bit running OBS and live stream together. Perhaps we will pick this up next week as well, since we've been at it for an hour already and I've hardly even noticed. Let's see. Let's try and finish off this at least. And then we'll call it quits for today's stream. So, yeah, how do we want to do this? Probably just recolor the whole thing slightly. Doesn't take much. Yes, yes. Yes, I mistyped. Thank you, Photoshop. Now it's not quite so olive. It's going to blend a little bit better. And if I go in and add some brighter green highlights, we're also going to do some stuff. Okay, Dylan, thank you. It's like having a secretary. Illustration, if you're not careful, is a bottomless time sink. And for me, I was telling Dylan about this the other day, actually. It's it's weird. I can do illustration, I can do graphic design, and I can do like game design, and I can do like game development. But I can't do all four at once or any two at once. I have to kind of like put down one thing and pick up something else. And then there's a little bit of an onboarding process of like spooling up and getting up to speed on that task. So I try not to switch back and forth too often. Because if I do, then I just get totally lost in the weeds. And things take forever. But once you start making progress on something like this, it's way easier to like finish this illustration and then go on to other stuff. So we've got a second bush that we can add in the bottom corner, and now that I've defined all my layers and all of my colors, all I have to do is paint some masks and we'll be set. So bottom, middle, loading, top, and now we have a second bush, and that bush took me all of 15 seconds to make. And it looks the same as the first one. Oh, it's actually not even on camera. There we go. It looks the same as the first one. Now you can see it. But now it's done. Jared says, oh, I know, I've looked up from working in Photoshop and realized it was almost morning. Yeah, it's been a number of years now since I've worked through the night on a Photoshop something or other. I tend not to do that anymore, just because I value my sleep. What kind of crazy person am I? I don't know. But yeah, there's tile illustration part 1. We'll get into more details, I think, next week. We'll pick this up and resume. That should be... should be good. Dylan says it would take me 15 hours to look 15% as good. But you always tell people you're not the art person. I don't expect that from people that aren't art. That's fine. This is why we're a good team. So until next week, stay safe. Get up to something interesting. Get out of the house if you can. Things are not so great here anymore. We're starting to lock down. We're starting to regress with our progress on COVID-19 pandemic, which is a little bit unfortunate. But on the flip side, I have... how many of these illustrations to do? 16? Something like that. I think I have to make 16 of these tiles for variation. And I'm going to be busy for a bit. So even if you don't see how this tile turns out, if I decide to finish it before next Friday, I'll show you another tile, or we'll work on something else in the same vein. So until next week, stay safe. See all of you later.